The Hades system earned its name from the dying binary stars at its center, two red giants locked in a slow spiral toward mutual destruction. The resulting stellar radiation created a hellish environment that the Deathworlders found comfortably familiar, and their enemies found nearly uninhabitable. Admiral Zara Kextal stood on the bridge of the Phoenix Ascendant, the Coalition's newest and most advanced warship, a hybrid design that incorporated salvaged Deathworlder technology with Imperial engineering principles. Around her, 37 ships representing the entire mobile force of the Phoenix Coalition prepared for the most desperate mission in their short, but bloody history. Intelligence update, she requested as they dropped out of hyperspace at the system's edge. The prison facility is exactly where our sources indicated, reported Lieutenant Velko. Asteroid-mounted fortress, heavily defended but relatively isolated. However, there's a complication. The tactical display lit up with contact markers. Deathworlder patrols have tripled since our last intelligence report. They're clearly expecting some kind of rescue attempt. Expected losses? Zara asked. Commander Steelclaw consulted his tactical analysis. Conservative estimate, 60% casualties, possibly higher. The fortress itself is built into a titanium-rich asteroid with natural armor over 2 kilometers thick. Even with concentrated fire from our entire fleet, we're looking at a minimum 4-hour siege. 4 hours we don't have, Captain Chin observed. Long-range sensors show 2 Deathworlder fleets approximately 6 hours out. If we're still engaged when they arrive, total annihilation, Zara finished. Understood. Alternative approaches? There is one possibility, said a new voice from the communication station. The speaker was Dr. Marcus Webb, but his usual diplomatic tone had been replaced by something harder and more focused. I've been analyzing the psychological profiles of our captured operatives. Commander Vasquez and her team aren't just soldiers, they're some of our most experienced saboteurs. Meaning what? Meaning they might not be as helpless as the Deathworlders assume. Elena's team had demolition charges and hacking equipment when they were captured. If they're still alive and conscious, they might be able to assist from the inside. It was a desperate hope, but it was better than nothing. Zara activated the fleet communications system. All ships, this is Admiral Kextal. You know why we're here. Our people are counting on us, and the entire resistance movement is watching. The Deathworlders think we're too weak to risk our lives for our comrades. Today we prove them wrong. The Coalition fleet accelerated toward the prison fortress, their ships spreading into attack formation. The design was elegant in its simplicity. Fast attack craft would engage the orbital defenses while heavier ships targeted the fortress itself. Meanwhile, specially equipped dropships would attempt to penetrate the facility's outer shell and extract the prisoners. The battle began exactly as predicted. Deathworlder patrol ships swarmed toward them like angry insects, their crude but effective weapons systems opening fire at maximum range. The Coalition ships danced between the incoming fire, their superior maneuverability allowing them to avoid most of the enemy barrage. First wave of patrols neutralized, Captain Chin reported. But the fortress is powering up its main defensive grid. The prison facility revealed its true nature as massive weapon emplacements emerged from concealed positions on the asteroid's surface. The firepower was staggering, enough to destroy a battleship with a single concentrated barrage. Begin attack pattern Omega, Zara commanded. The Coalition ships scattered, using the asteroid field around the fortress as cover while they approached from multiple vectors. It was a tactic that would have been impossible for the more rigid Deathworlder fleet formations, but the Coalition had learned to fight like insurgents even in space combat. Penetration teams launching, reported Commander Steelclaw. 3 heavily armored shuttles broke away from the main fleet, heading for what intelligence had identified as maintenance ports on the fortress's lower surface. Contact! Enemy reinforcements dropping out of hyperspace, warned the sensor operator. 12 heavy cruisers closing fast. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had been a risky but manageable assault was becoming a desperate fighting retreat. Zara watched the casualty reports climb as coalition ships exchanged fire with vastly superior numbers of enemy vessels. "Admiral," came a voice from the communication station. "We're receiving a transmission from inside the fortress. It's Commander Vasquez." The main screen flickered to show Elena Vasquez's face, battered but determined. Behind her, explosions and the sound of weapons fire indicated that something significant was happening inside the prison facility. "Admiral, we've managed to break containment and reach the facility's power core. My team can overload the primary reactor, but it will destroy the entire fortress. What about evacuation?" "Negative, ma'am. The Deathworlders sealed all escape routes when we broke free. But there are over 2,000 prisoners here, not just coalition operatives. If we don't act, they're all going to be executed anyway." Zara felt the weight of command crushing down on her. Elena was offering to sacrifice herself and her entire team to save the other prisoners, but it would also eliminate any chance of gaining intelligence from the facility. "Elena, what about the data cores? Any intelligence on Deathworlder operations?" "Already downloaded and transmitted to the penetration teams." "Admiral, you need to understand, this facility isn't just a prison. It's a research center. They're experimenting on the prisoners, trying to understand how soft species can be modified to serve their empire." The implications were horrifying. The Deathworlders weren't just eliminating their enemies. They were trying to convert them into loyal servants through genetic and cybernetic modification. "How long do you need?" 3 minutes to reach the core. Another 2 minutes to set the charges. You should be clear by then." Zara looked at the tactical display. 3 coalition ships had already been destroyed, and the enemy reinforcements were closing rapidly. In 5 minutes, they might all be dead anyway. "Do it," she commanded. "All ships, emergency withdrawal. We have 4 minutes to clear the blast radius." The coalition fleet turned and accelerated away from the fortress, their engines pushed beyond safe operational limits. Behind them, the Deathworlder ships gave pursuit, clearly intending to prevent any coalition vessels from escaping. "Admiral," the communications officer reported, "Commander Vasquez is requesting permission to transmit a final message to the fleet." "Put her through." Elena's face appeared on the screen one last time. Around her, the other captured operatives worked frantically to overload the reactor core while explosions shook the facility. "Admiral, tell the resistance networks that the Phoenix Protocol worked. We made contact with dozens of cells, provided training and equipment. The underground is stronger than the Deathworlders realize. And tell everyone that we chose this. We're not victims, we're soldiers, and we're proud to serve." The transmission cut to static just as a brilliant flash lit up the Hades system. The prison fortress, along with the asteroid it was built into, vanished in an expanding sphere of nuclear fire that briefly outshone the dying binary stars. When the blast wave passed, 12 Deathworlder ships had been caught in the explosion and destroyed. The remaining enemy vessels pulled back, apparently unwilling to continue the pursuit after such devastating losses. "Final casualty reports," Zara requested as the fleet regrouped. 7 ships lost, including all 3 penetration teams, Captain Chim reported quietly. "Estimated 1,847 personnel killed in action. However, the intelligence data recovered by Commander Vasquez's team is extensive." As the coalition fleet jumped back into hyperspace, carrying word of their Pyrrhic victory to the scattered resistance networks, Zara found herself thinking about Elena's final words. They had chosen to become soldiers, to abandon the peaceful ideals of the old empire in favor of something harder and more violent. But perhaps that choice had been necessary. The galaxy was no longer a place where civilization could rely on mutual respect and diplomatic solutions. Sometimes, peace had to be defended with violence. The Phoenix Coalition had been forged in the flames of war, and they were rapidly becoming something the Deathworlders had never expected, an enemy that combined the strategic thinking of the old empire with the ruthless determination of their own warrior culture. The question now was whether they could evolve fast enough to save what remained of galactic civilization before the Deathworlders completed their genocidal campaign. 3 months after the Battle of Hades, The Phoenix Coalition had become something unrecognizable from its origins as a refugee fleet. Operating from 7 hidden bases scattered across the galactic rim, they commanded a force of over 300 ships and coordinated with resistance networks spanning 47 star systems. Admiral Zara Kextel stood in the war room of Liberation Base, studying holographic displays that showed the current state of the galactic conflict. The data that Commander Vasquez had died to obtain had revolutionized their understanding of the enemy. "Intelligence analysis complete," reported Lieutenant Velko, now bearing the rank insignia of the Coalition's Chief Intelligence Officer. "The Deathworlder Coalition is more fractured than we initially realized. Our operations have exacerbated existing tensions between member species." The holographic display showed the Thanatos Collective's territory color-coded by controlling faction. What had once appeared to be a unified empire was revealed as a patchwork of competing interests held together primarily by fear of war leader Krothvex. "The Chromaxi Death Clans are in open revolt against collective authority in 3 sectors," Velko continued. "They're claiming that Krothvex's focus on hunting Coalition remnants is allowing other enemy factions to gain strength." Dr. Webb, now bearing the uniform of a Coalition strategic advisor, leaned forward to examine the data. "What about the force recruitment programs? The prison facility intelligence?" "Worse than we feared," replied Commander Steelclaw. "They're not just converting prisoners into soldiers, they're attempting to create an entirely new class of serval species. The research data indicates they've successfully modified over 50,000 individuals from various soft species to serve as specialized workers." The concept was horrifying. The Deathworlders were literally trying to redesign the galaxy's populations to fit their vision of a perfect society, one where only approved forms of life were permitted to exist. "However," Steelclaw continued, "their expansion has created vulnerabilities. They're stretched thin across thousands of systems, relying increasingly on converted troops and enslaved populations to maintain control. Local resistance is growing stronger because they're defending their homes rather than abstract ideals." Zara studied the tactical projections. "What's our current operational capability?" "Better than expected," reported Captain Chin, who had been promoted to Coalition Fleet Commander. "The weapons and shipbuilding data we captured has allowed us to upgrade our vessels significantly. We're also manufacturing new ships using hidden asteroid facilities." The Coalition's industrial capacity had grown through desperate innovation. Unable to match the Deathworlders' massive industrial base, they had developed distributed manufacturing systems that could produce weapons, ships, and supplies from raw materials found in asteroid fields and dead systems. "More importantly," Chen continued, "recruitment is accelerating. Word of our victories is spreading through the occupied territories. We've had entire planetary resistance movements request formal incorporation into the Coalition." "What kind of numbers are we talking about?" "Conservatively, over 2 million active resistance fighters across Coalition-linked networks. They're still primarily guerrilla forces, but we're working to establish formal military training programs." 2 million fighters was a significant force, but it was still a fraction of the Deathworlder military machine. However, the resistance movements had advantages that regular armies lacked: local knowledge, popular support, and the desperate motivation of people fighting for their very existence. "Admiral," came a voice from the communication station. "Priority transmission from Resistance Cell Omega-7. They're requesting immediate Coalition support for a major operation." "Put them through." The holographic display shifted to show a figure that made everyone in the room pause. The speaker was clearly Thylorian, but his appearance had been dramatically altered. Where once had been the peaceful, almost ethereal features typical of his species, there were now visible cybernetic implants and scarring that suggested extensive combat experience. "Admiral Kextel, this is Colonel Shandar of the Thylorian Liberation Front. We have an opportunity to strike a decisive blow against the Collective, but we need Coalition support." Shandar's transformation was a stark example of how the war had changed everyone involved. The Thylorians had been among the most pacifistic species in the Empire, known for their philosophical traditions and artistic achievements. To see one of them bearing military rank and battle scars was both inspiring and deeply troubling. "What kind of operation, Colonel?" "Intelligence indicates that War Leader Krothvex will be attending a gathering of collective leadership on Nemesis Prime in 2 weeks. All major faction leaders will be present for what they're calling a unity conclave, presumably to address the growing internal tensions we've been exploiting." The implications were staggering. If the Coalition could eliminate the entire Deathworlder leadership structure in a single operation, it might collapse their empire overnight. "What's the strategic situation?" Zara asked. "Nemesis Prime is the Collective's administrative capital, heavily defended, but the defenses are designed to repel external attack. They're not expecting an assault from resistance forces already present on the planet." "You have assets in place?" "More than that. The entire planetary resistance network is prepared to participate. Over 40,000 fighters, including several hundred defectors from the Collective's enslaved forces. But we need Coalition ships to provide orbital fire support and extract the assault teams after the mission." Dr. Webb looked troubled. "What about civilian casualties?" "Nemesis Prime has a population of over 6 billion. Mostly converted or enslaved populations," Shandar replied grimly. "And if we don't act, they'll be systematically processed through the modification centers anyway. At least this way, they have a chance for freedom." It was the kind of impossible choice that had become routine for Coalition leadership. Every major operation involved potential casualties among the very populations they were trying to save. "Estimated success probability?" Zara asked. "Unknown," Steelclaw interjected. "This would be the largest coordinated operation in Coalition history. Success would effectively decapitate the Deathworlder command structure. Failure would result in the loss of our entire mobile fleet and the destruction of the most effective resistance network in the occupied territories. And if we do nothing? The Collective continues its expansion and genocide, eventually hunting down and destroying every remaining Coalition base." Zara looked around the war room at the faces of her staff. They had come so far from the desperate refugees who had fled into exile 4 years ago. But they were also facing the biggest gamble of their existence, a single operation that would either liberate the galaxy or destroy the last hope of resistance. "How long do we have to decide?" "The conclave begins in 14 standard days," Shandar replied. "We need to begin positioning Coalition forces within 6 days to have any chance of success." "Understood. We'll have an answer for you within 24 hours. As the transmission ended, the war room fell silent. Everyone understood the magnitude of the decision they were facing. "Options?" Zara asked. "We could attempt a smaller operation," suggested Captain Shin. "Target individual faction leaders rather than the entire conclave. That might actually make things worse," Dr. Webb pointed out. "If we eliminate some leaders but not others, the survivors might unify against us more effectively. Or we could continue our current strategy," Velko added. "Gradual pressure, supporting local resistance, slowly wearing down their cohesion. Which gives them time to complete their genocide," Steelclaw countered. "And time to develop countermeasures to our tactics." Zara realized that there was no safe choice. Every option involved potentially catastrophic risks. But perhaps that was appropriate. The Phoenix Coalition had been born from catastrophe, forged in desperate battles, and sustained by impossible victories. "Schedule a full staff meeting for 0800 tomorrow," she decided. "I want detailed analysis of every aspect of this operation. And I want input from every department: tactical, intelligence, logistics, medical, engineering. If we're going to bet everything on a single throw of the dice, we're going to make sure those dice are loaded in our favor." As the meeting broke up and officers returned to their duties, Zara found herself alone in the war room, staring at the holographic representation of the galaxy. The blue dots representing free systems had dwindled to a handful of hidden bases and isolated resistance cells. The red markers of Deathworlder control dominated every sector. But scattered throughout that sea of red were tiny green dots, resistance networks, sabotage cells, and underground movements that refused to accept defeat. They were the scattered embers of the old Empire's flame, waiting for someone to fan them back into fire. The Phoenix Coalition had been named for a mythical bird that rose from its own ashes. Perhaps it was time to discover whether that myth could become reality on a galactic scale. The assault on Nemesis Prime began with a single transmission broadcast simultaneously to every resistance cell in the occupied territories. The message was brief, coded, and carried the authorization of Admiral Zara Kextel herself. The Phoenix rises. Engage all targets. Across 47 star systems, 2 million resistance fighters emerged from hiding and struck at Deathworlder installations. Supply depots exploded, communication networks went dark, and garrison forces found themselves fighting desperate battles on dozens of worlds simultaneously. But the real battle was taking place in the Nemesis system, where the Coalition's entire mobile fleet, now grown to over 400 ships, faced the heaviest concentration of Deathworlder forces in the galaxy. Status report. Zara commanded from the bridge of the Phoenix Ascendant as her fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the system's edge. Nemesis Prime's orbital defenses are active and tracking us, reported Captain Chen. 67 Deathworlder capital ships in defensive formation, plus extensive fixed installations. We're outnumbered 4-1. What about the resistance forces? Colonel Shandar reports all planetary networks are in position. 43,000 fighters standing by for simultaneous assault on collective leadership positions. The plan was ambitious beyond anything the Coalition had ever attempted. While the fleet engaged the orbital defenses, resistance teams would assault the Unity Conclave directly. The goal was to eliminate the entire Deathworlder command structure in a single devastating blow. Enemy formations moving to intercept, warned the tactical officer. They're not waiting for us to close. They're coming out to meet us. It was exactly what Steelclaw had predicted. The Deathworlders were confident in their numerical superiority and intended to crush the Coalition fleet before it could reach the planet. All ships, implement Battle Plan Prometheus, Zara commanded. Remember, we only need to hold them for 4 hours. The resistance teams will do the rest. The Coalition fleet scattered into 6 separate attack groups, each approaching Nemesis Prime from a different vector. It was a formation that would have been suicide for any conventional force, but the Coalition had learned to fight like insurgents even in space combat. The battle was joined with the distinctive thunderclap of capital ship weapons firing at maximum range. Coalition ships danced between incoming fire, using their superior maneuverability to avoid the worst of the enemy barrage while returning fire with weapons systems that had been upgraded using captured Deathworlder technology. First enemy casualties confirmed, Chen reported. But we're taking heavy losses. The determination and steady progress are both showing critical damage. On the surface of Nemesis Prime, Colonel Shandar crouched in the ruins of what had once been a magnificent Imperial embassy, now converted into a Deathworlder administrative center. Around him, 43,000 resistance fighters waited for the signal to begin the most desperate assault in galactic history. Unity Conclave confirmed in session, whispered his communications officer. All major faction leaders present, including War Leader Krothvex. Through his tactical display, Shandar could see the orbital battle raging overhead. Brilliant flashes of weapons fire illuminated the sky as Coalition ships engaged the massive Deathworlder fleet. Every explosion represented hundreds of lives lost, but the sacrifice was necessary if they were going to end this war. All teams, this is Colonel Shandar, he transmitted to the resistance networks. Operation Phoenix begins now. Strike hard, strike fast, and show these bastards what happens when they underestimate the power of free peoples fighting for their homes. The assault began with coordinated strikes on communication centers, power plants, and military installations across Nemesis Prime. Resistance fighters emerged from hidden bunkers and safe houses, armed with weapons that had been smuggled in over months of careful preparation. The Deathworlders, accustomed to fighting external enemies, were completely unprepared for an uprising that erupted simultaneously across their most secure world. Garrison forces found themselves under attack from within their own territories, fighting desperately to maintain control of critical installations. But the primary objective was the Unity Conclave itself, a heavily fortified complex where the Deathworlder leadership had gathered to address the growing crisis within their empire. Shandar led the assault personally, his modified Thylorian physiology allowing him to move with speed and grace through the compound's defensive barriers. Behind him, fighters from dozens of different species worked together with the coordination that only shared suffering could create. "Perimeter breached," reported his tactical officer as they fought their way through the complex's outer defenses. "Collective security forces are falling back to secondary positions." The resistance had several advantages that the Deathworlders hadn't anticipated. Many of the fighters were former slaves who knew the complex's layout intimately. Others were defectors from the collective's own forces, individuals who had finally reached their breaking point after years of serving an empire built on genocide. "Colonel," came a transmission from one of the assault teams. "We've reached the conclave chamber. All faction leaders are present, but they're heavily defended. What's your status?" "We can breach the chamber, but it will require everything we have. No guarantee of extraction." Shandar looked up at the sky, where the orbital battle continued to rage. Coalition ships were fighting desperately to maintain their position, but it was clear they couldn't hold much longer against such overwhelming odds. "Do it," he commanded. "All teams converge on the conclave chamber. This is what we came for." The final assault was a desperate rush through corridors filled with Deathworlder security forces. Resistance fighters fell by the dozens, but their sacrifice opened the path for others to advance. The complex's defensive systems, designed to repel external attack, were overwhelmed by enemies who were already inside. When the conclave chamber doors finally exploded inward, Shandar found himself face to face with the leaders of the Thanatos Collective. War Leader Krothvek stood at the center of the group, his massive form radiating the predatory confidence that had terrorized the galaxy. "Impossible," the War Leader snarled. "The soft races do not have the strength for such an assault." "You're right," Shandar replied as his fighters poured into the chamber. "We didn't have the strength. So we became stronger." The battle in the conclave chamber lasted only minutes, but it changed the course of galactic history. When it was over, the entire leadership structure of the Thanatos Collective lay dead, and resistance fighters throughout the complex were broadcasting news of the victory to their colleagues across the galaxy. In orbit, Admiral Zara Kextel watched as the Deathworlder fleet suddenly began to lose cohesion. With their leadership dead and no clear chain of command, individual ship captains began making their own decisions about whether to continue the fight. "Enemy formations breaking up," Captain Chen reported with amazement. "Multiple ships are withdrawing from combat. Others appear to be engaging each other." It was exactly what Commander Steelclaw had predicted. Without the central authority of the war leader, the various Deathworlder factions reverted to their natural state of mutual competition and mistrust. "All coalition ships, begin withdrawal to extraction points," Zara commanded. "Prepare to receive resistance fighters from the surface." The evacuation was chaotic but successful. Thousands of resistance fighters were lifted off Nemesis Prime as the planet descended into civil war between competing Deathworlder factions. Colonel Shandar was among the last to be extracted, having remained on the surface to coordinate the resistance network's transition to legitimate planetary government. As the Coalition fleet jumped into hyperspace, carrying news of their incredible victory to resistance cells throughout the galaxy, Zara allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. They had achieved something that many had thought impossible: the decapitation of the Deathworlder command structure and the liberation of their most important world. But the war was far from over. The Thanatos Collective might be leaderless and fractured, but millions of Deathworlder ships still controlled vast territories across the galaxy. The Phoenix Coalition had won a crucial battle, but the struggle to rebuild civilization from the ashes of war was just beginning. Epilogue: New Dawn. 2 years after the Battle of Nemesis Prime, Admiral Zara Kextel stood on the observation deck of New Vega Station, watching construction crews put the finishing touches on humanity's first major space habitat since the fall. Around the station, a steady stream of ships carried refugees, supplies, and materials for the massive reconstruction effort that was transforming the galaxy. The aftermath of the collective's collapse had been even more chaotic than anyone had predicted. Without central leadership, the various Deathworlder factions had turned on each other with the same brutality they had previously directed at their conquered subjects. Entire star systems had been devastated in civil wars between competing warlords. But from that chaos, something new was emerging. The Phoenix Coalition had evolved into the Galactic Reconstruction Alliance, dedicated to helping liberated worlds rebuild their societies while preventing the return of either imperial stagnation or Deathworlder tyranny. Status report, Zara requested as Dr. Webb joined her at the observation window. Better than we had any right to expect, the physician replied, consulting his data tablet. 47 star systems have formally joined the Alliance. Another 130 worlds have requested membership but are still working through the transition process. What about the remaining Deathworlder factions? Fragmented and largely contained. The Chromaxi Death Clans control about 30 systems on the Galactic Rim, but they're mostly fighting each other. The Vorthan Reapers have established a small empire in the Andromeda sector, but they seem more interested in raiding than conquest. It was a far cry from the unified threat that had once terrorized the galaxy, but Webb's expression suggested there were still concerns. The real challenge, he continued, is preventing the cycle from repeating. We've learned that both the old Empire's pacifism and the Deathworlders' militarism were unsustainable extremes. The Alliance is trying to find a middle path, strong enough to defend civilization, but not so rigid that it stifles growth and adaptation. Through the observation window, they could see ships from dozens of different species working together on construction projects. Kilari engineers collaborated with human technicians, while Thylorian artists worked alongside Nexari warriors to design spaces that balanced functionality with beauty. Any word from the deep exploration missions? Zara asked. Fascinating discoveries, Webb replied with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in months. It turns out the galaxy is much larger and more diverse than either the Empire or the Collective realized. Long-range surveys have identified over 300 previously unknown species, most of whom developed in isolation during the age of imperial expansion. How are they responding to contact? Cautiously, but positively. Most of them watch the war from a distance and are interested in joining a galactic community that respects their independence. The Alliance's principle of voluntary association is very attractive to species that remember being forced into the Empire or threatened by the Collective. Zara nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized was there. For so long, their focus had been on survival and resistance. The idea that they might actually be building something better than what came before was still difficult to process. What about you, Doctor? Any regrets about the path we chose? Webb considered the question seriously. We became something the old Empire would have found horrifying, a military organization that solved problems through violence. But we also became something the Deathworlders couldn't understand, people who chose to fight not for dominance, but for the right to be peaceful. And now? Now we have the chance to prove that evolution doesn't have to mean choosing between strength and compassion. The Alliance military trains every soldier in both combat and humanitarian aid. Our diplomats carry weapons but prefer to use words. Our scientists study both defensive technologies and methods for healing damaged ecosystems. Through the viewport, a new ship appeared on approach vector, a vessel of unfamiliar design that transmitted Alliance recognition codes. Another new species making contact, another opportunity to expand their growing community of free worlds. Admiral, came a voice from the communication station. Priority transmission from Alliance Command. They're requesting your input on the proposed expedition to the Magellanic Clouds. The Magellanic Clouds, satellite galaxies that lay beyond the reach of both the old Empire and the Deathworlder Collective. Long-range sensors had detected signs of advanced civilizations there, potentially facing their own challenges and conflicts. What kind of expedition? Zara asked. Mixed diplomatic and scientific mission. A chance to make contact with entirely new forms of life and possibly offer assistance if they're facing their own version of what we went through. It was exactly the kind of mission that embodied everything the Alliance stood for: the exploration of new possibilities combined with the willingness to help others facing existential threats. Tell them I'm interested, Zara decided. But only if they're planning a proper multi-species crew. No more human-dominated expeditions or single-species colonies. We've learned that diversity is strength. As the communications officer transmitted her response, Zara found herself thinking about the long journey that had brought them to this point. They had begun as desperate refugees fleeing the collapse of a dying empire. They had become hardened warriors fighting for survival against genocidal enemies. And now they were evolving again, into something that was neither the passive empire nor the brutal collective. They were becoming explorers again, but explorers who understood that the galaxy was vast enough for countless different forms of life to flourish simultaneously. They were becoming builders again, but builders who had learned that true strength came from cooperation rather than domination. The Phoenix had indeed risen from the ashes of the old galaxy. But unlike the mythical bird that simply returned to its original form, the Phoenix Coalition had become something entirely new, a force for growth, change, and hope in a universe that had almost forgotten such concepts were possible. Outside the viewport, the construction of New Vega Station continued while beyond it, the ships of a dozen different species traveled freely among the stars. It wasn't the galaxy that anyone had expected to inherit, but it might just be the galaxy that everyone deserved. The age of empires was over. The age of alliance had begun. And somewhere in the vast cosmic distances between galaxies, other civilizations were receiving their first radio signals from the Galactic Reconstruction Alliance, messages of friendship, offers of aid, and invitations to join a community dedicated to the principle that the universe was vast enough for everyone to find their place among the stars. The last stand had become a new beginning. And the galaxy would never be the same.